Hey everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Debrief here on FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, joined in studio by Ted Baker. He is the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. We are back again after a week off. I had a birthday this week, so my schedule was a little wacky. We were going to be coming to you guys yesterday, but we had a little bit of a delay there as well. Ted was a little under the weather. He is not under the weather today. He's looking spry as always. So we've got a bunch of interesting topics to talk about today, Ted. We're going to start off with some of the quick hitters, some of the stuff that popped up over the last 4 or 5 days before we get into the bigger topics, some of which we've talked a little bit about. Others we've kind of grazed over and probably not spent too much time talking about. Anyway, let's start with streaming issues with Geneva City Council meetings. It's kind of been this behind-the-scenes theme now for, I guess, the last month or so, whether it be the PAB meetings or whether it be audio quality, which frankly has become unintelligible at different points during even regular city council meetings, and now kind of the looming background concern that meetings may just stop being live streamed altogether. Question is, or at least the question I have for you is, shouldn't all meetings be live streamed, period? Like, are we at a point now, pandemic aside, people have gotten so accustomed to this, shouldn't we just be streaming all of these meetings all together? The technology isn't exactly space age. It's not like this is technology that's difficult to use or to work with.
I don't know if we should necessarily require all meetings to be streamed. I think that might put a bigger burden on very small boards and very small communities compared to bigger cities. But I think certainly the issue is during a pandemic or at any other time, if you're going to limit public attendance at a meeting in any way, then the streamed meeting becomes as important or more important than the live meeting. So I think that when the council, and I don't even know the answer, is Geneva back to full attendance yet, or are they still limiting in-person attendance?
I believe, as I understand it, that was the issue with the venue this past week, was that they were going back to full attendance, and they did not think that the venue they had been using would be able to accommodate as many people as would potentially show up. So they opted to change the venue, which, if what I have heard is correct, also was an issue because they didn't really publicize that well leading up to the meeting. And some people didn't know an hour and a half, 2 hours before the meeting where it was actually going to take place.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue. So I think the bigger issue is if you're going to limit attendance and the stream stops, then the meeting should stop immediately. I mean, right. And I know we had a little bit of a conversation. I'm guessing that the state's open meeting laws probably haven't caught up to some of these new realities. So that's one thing. If you're going to limit attendance, or even for that matter, if you're going to encourage people to go on the stream to get the meeting, then if the stream quits, the meeting should stop. I mean, I don't think it's right to have a city council continue meeting for an hour when there's no one there and no member of the public has any way to get the access to that meeting.
Yeah, and I think once the emergency order at the state level dropped, I believe that took care of any of the attendance issues. And I don't know of any even smaller towns and villages that have continued to limit public attendance at meetings since that order changed at the end of, or
now, I
of the
think
month.
we ought to encourage streaming because one of the big topics we always come back to is just openness of government. The more people who know what their government is doing, the better off we are and the better government will get. So I think communities ought to start looking at this, but then, and I don't know if, I don't know all the technical details of what the city's doing, if they've had someone doing this for them or if they're trying to do it themselves. it would behoove them to spend some money to get someone who knows how to do it and to check things out. I don't know if any of these venue shifts have been an issue. I mean, as we know, we broadcast our sports games over wireless internet, and some places you get better reception than others. So whether they didn't check this newest venue to see if there were any problems, sometimes getting a signal out of an enclosed building can be more difficult. So there's a lot of technical issues there, and I think open meeting law issues that do need to be addressed.
Yeah, so I think two things there. One is that streaming needs to not be viewed as this like foreign, really difficult thing to accomplish. The city has an IT department. I don't know how many people actually work in said department, but they have an IT department. Every county has an IT department. And if we're talking,
have 10-year-old kids at home who could come in and do it,
right?
If the IT can't,
I know a few people have thrown this at me and said, "Well, yeah, you do that for a living, so it's easy for you to say it's easy, but it's not for X, Y, and Z people." And my answer to that is, well, then your government isn't really a reflection of the community, then, is it? Because if all you have are a bunch of 60-plussers who don't understand how to make a live stream happen when it isn't that complicated. Yeah, I know. But
I'm a 60-plusser.
Point being, though, and, it isn't that difficult. Let's also couple that up with the fact that if you're a municipality that's managing a multi-million-dollar budget, live streaming isn't that complicated, right? Managing a multi-million-dollar budget in a municipality of 12,000 people, that's complicated. Putting together a live stream, not complicated by comparison. So I think
you need a phone and a Facebook account.
Right. Like my frustration, I guess, and that's the bare minimum, right? Like you can do a more advanced setup that, doesn't take any more than 4 or 5 hours of thought, and then it's there forever. But point is, I think it's a reflection of what some elected officials are really willing to do in terms of the work they're really willing to put into creating better public access. If all else fails, get a video camera, shoot the thing, and upload it afterward. There is no, you can press record, you can point a camera in a room that isn't an echo chamber at a group of 5 or 6 people. You can record an hour or 2 hours. You can throw the SD card in a computer and upload that video raw without any edits at all up online, and it might take, 30 minutes? I mean, that part, to me, that is like the minimum threshold, because that is, and I keep making this comparison to modern day minutes. Video, audio are the modern day minutes. Like minutes are talk to any journalist or reporter who's ever done work over the last 20 years in small, medium, large communities. Minutes have progressively been getting worse and worse and worse. And now they're useless. They're completely useless. I'll have clerks at different counties and different towns send me minutes, and it's chicken scratch. It's broken down words cobbled together that don't make any sense, and there's nothing you can possibly make of them. So as far as being a good way for people to know what's happening at these meetings after the fact, I mean, it's just not.
Well, and it brings up another issue, one of our larger issues we deal with, which is just the openness issue in general. I think institutionally, government institutions don't really want to be open, because it becomes a pain in the butt. The more people who know what you're doing, the more people who are going to have some thoughts about it and are going to be calling you up at home, city councilor, to tell you what they think. I really think that's part of it. I think secretly, if not openly, a lot of government officials would rather have a lot less public participation, and it would make their lives easier.
So jumping to our next topic, NBC News produced this week a lengthy, I'll call it a rewrite, and I'm going to take some grief for this, of what has been continued thorough local reporting on the Greenwich Bitcoin issue. It had a national reporter attached to it who I believe was at a recent event out in Avon where one of the more high-profile protests took place. I think there were also some reporters from possibly the New York Times and a couple other larger publications as well. But I haven't seen stories yet from those publications. But what I'll say, I want to basically get your thoughts on the prospect of national reporting on what has been a hyperlocal issue. But my general thoughts on this are just that, one, they hijacked a story, and this is like the one gripe that local reporters always have with people who work for these gigantic companies. They hijacked the story, right? They hijacked the work that had already been done by local reporters, and then on top of that, they grossly misrepresented the individuals in the story. So they described Peter Mantius, who, by the way, has been the only reason that this story has gotten any traction whatsoever in the journalism, in the world of reporting and journalism and news. They called him a retired newspaper man. What? Like, it is just, it's insane. And I think that this is one of those examples. And, you know, we see it from time to time in other parts of the country. This is probably the first time we've seen it locally where a big entity has sort of parachuted in and just sort of picked up a story. And the bigger long-term problem, I think, is that it becomes kind of like a one-hitter. They came in, they did their long profile, rewriting a bunch of stories essentially that have already been written and stories that have already been told. And the activists can say, they can hang their hat on it and they can say, well, see, we got this attention, but they're not going to be back. There's not going to be this continued dialogue or continued reporting at NBC about environmental issues on Seneca Lake. And, you know, this is one of many environmental issues that matter. And it is incredibly frustrating as a reporter at a local digital news organization to see this happen again. Because I have friends all over the country who are journalists and will always joke about these kinds of examples. But when it happens in your own backyard, that's when you really start to see, you're like, what on earth is this?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting you use the term because it's the same term I use, which is parachute journalism. What happens is, first off, they're writing for a national audience. So a lot of the local details don't really matter so much to a national audience. But I think here's what happens with these kinds of stories and this kind of journalism is somebody comes in, and it's NBC in this case, and they want to know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. They have their story basically formulated in their minds before they even arrive here, and then they go looking for sound bites that will match their preconceived idea of the story. They also get a lot of details wrong because they simply don't spend the time to do the research. And you also, you brought up another thing that I've seen this in a lot of journalism on the national level, and that is failure to really disclose who sources are. There have been, for example, the story in Virginia about teaching critical race theory, and some of the national reporting would identify a source as a retired school teacher or something, when in fact they were an activist working very passionately on one side of the issue or the other. So there's just a lot of factors there that come into play. So, I mean, I can understand the frustration on the part of local journalists, but basically it's a hit and run piece. They'll come in, they'll do their piece, it'll go out. It isn't going to change anybody's minds. I mean, it's just, you know, and like I said, too, it's written for people on the national level. So the details of Seneca Lake or what's going on in Seneca Lake isn't of any great interest to a national audience. But it is frustrating to see people that make a heck of a lot more money than you do come in and do half the work and get, you know, 100 times the run out of that story that the local people do.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's one of those situations where I think, you know, it's particularly frustrating because of the work that someone like Peter did, and then to be represented the way he was. He was effectively boiled, even though he's the reason why that story was able to exist on NBC News. He was essentially boiled down to a blogger who just kind of writes in his free time.
Well, and that's also one of the things that national news media will never do, is they don't want to shine the light on local reporters. They're not going to say the whole reason we're here is because of this reporter who's been breaking stories on this issue all along. they kind of want to take ownership of it. I mean, it's almost like, the cliche in movies where there's a murder or something, and then the FBI comes in and they start pushing the local cops around, and there's all that resentment. It's kind of the same type of story, only on the journalism level.
Yeah. And then this week we had a pretty significant movement, or so it seemed, at least on the surface. Gun violence taking center stage via executive order, and now we see there's a federal task force on the topic as well. The big question that we kept getting from readers throughout the week was, is this lip service, or is this something that could actually help in some of the cities that are dealing with the most gun violence, and I'll say violence in general? And I think the answer is no. It's pretty much just a surface level solution to an institutional problem. And I know there's a lot of pushback against the idea that this is anything other than just a culture problem, where you have people who are in bad families and bad neighborhoods, and it's just bad people doing bad things. There is that, and there's people want it to be that. But we're going to talk about a worker shortage coming up in a little while. We're going to talk about a decline in enrollment at colleges in a little while. And it's really hard to look at a lot of these systemic issues and not just see them as gigantic education failures. Use the city of Rochester as an example. One of the most troubled school districts in the country, bar none. And it is also one of the most violent. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all. And, that is probably one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now, is no real solutions to the root problems, and instead just a lot of surface level political stuff to make people think that something is being done.
Well, we have no solutions to the root problems because we have no agreement yet, and may never, on what the root problems are. It breaks down. People on the left say, get rid of the guns. People on the right, for the most part, refuse to take any steps in that direction. People on the left talk about underlying socioeconomic issues. People on the right don't believe in those issues. I mean, you just said it. There's a belief in some quarters that it's bad people doing bad things. Bail reform gets blamed on this frequently. So I looked this up the other day because we were having this conversation on my morning show. I looked it up, and before bail reform in New York, 76% of arrested people were let go pending trial. After bail reform, it's 91%. So that's 15%. So that's 1 person out of 7. So 6 out of 7 arrestees are treated exactly the same now as they were before bail reform. So that kind of puts the lie to that argument right there. It's very hard to believe that 1 person out of 7 is responsible for this sudden surge in violence. I think a lot of it is a global pandemic that has messed with our heads and our lives for the past year plus. I think it's part of the economic stuff. I think it ties into our worker issue we're going to talk about. My own personal liberal lefty belief is that people don't take up crime because it's fun or they think it's cool. They take up crime because they don't see a better option. They don't see a way to find a decent job that will pay them enough to live a decent life. So they turn to violent crime. So long story short, we can't agree on the core issues. I think if left and right would just give in 50% to the other side and say, okay, if people on the right would say, okay, yeah, there are socioeconomic issues, let's try to solve them. Great. And then if people on the left would say, all right, now you on the right, please agree that part of the problem is guns are too easy to get in our country, then maybe we could start working on it. But I don't see that happening. I don't see this making any impact. I've never seen it. I mean, I've been in media for 1,000,000 years, and there's a flurry of gun violence, and then there's some sort of action against it, and then nothing happens, and then we get more gun violence. So we can't solve the problem until we can at least come up with some kind of agreement on what the problem is.
Yeah, and I think another part of this is that, I think the city of Rochester has had in the low 30s in terms of homicides to year to date. And it's a high number compared to, quote unquote, a normal year.
Right.
But I think the other part of this too is that it's very easy for the city at large or the community at large to pretend it's not an issue, because at the end of the day, you're still only talking about 30-something homicides. And yes, that means you're talking about a homicide on the morning news every, say, 3 or 4 days. But problem with that is, it doesn't change the fact that most people can go about their lives without seeing much different. And I'll say this, I've been in the city as many times this year as I have been any other year. I've walked the streets. I feel perfectly safe. Everything seems completely normal. And it isn't this violent Wild West that, some people are trying to paint it. And it is a lot, people on the political right trying to paint cities as this Wild West, as this place that, is just rampant with violence. Yes, there are bad things that have happened, but they are happening in neighborhoods that have been generally neglected for the last 50 years.
Well, and I heard the statistic, and I can't vouch for it this morning, but someone said, I believe it was half the murders in America happen in 2% of the counties, and within those counties, they happen in specific areas of a few blocks. So what we have, most of the gun violence in America is taking place in some horrible inner cities where they have issues of poverty and poor housing and poor education. So it isn't a nationwide problem. If you go into Rochester, New York, you can walk around most of the sidewalks and feel perfectly safe. However, there are probably about 4 or 5 streets in Rochester, New York, where if you're walking down those streets after dark, there's a decent chance you'll hear a gunshot on a given night. Yeah. So, I mean, there's another part of the issue is we need to target where this stuff is actually happening and stop trying to pretend, like you said, the Wild West. I mean, there are those on the right who want you to believe that, the entirety of Portland, Oregon has been on fire for the last 2 years. It's just not the case.
My favorite comment to read on Facebook anytime there's a story about a homicide or a violent crime happening in any city are the people who live around said city, not in that city, but around that city, and say, this is why I never go here.
Right.
This is why I never take my kids there. And I've seen it happen even with Geneva before. And it's like, you don't ever leave your small town. You don't ever go anywhere. It has nothing to do with violence. It has to do with a personal choice because you are just blocked off and you choose not to leave your small town. Fine, live that life. But don't try to paint this scenario as something other than what it is, which is institutional failures over a long period of time. And it's funny because what you just described shows how actually easy it would be to fix it, because we are talking about hyper local communities. You can correct a lot of this problem by just getting into those neighborhoods, frankly, and starting to go through the process of rehabbing 50 years of failure.
And I would guess that the reason that the people in those neighborhoods are turning to crime is because they don't see any better option.
Yep.
I think if they were given better options, and that's why a lot of people on the right laugh about things like job training, and they just see it as a bunch of liberal hand-holding.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the case.
So let's get into another topic here, one of our bigger topics for the day. This past weekend was the July 4th holiday, which means we are in the heart of summer. However, as usual, Monday, while I was running some errands, rekindled the annual tradition of seeing seasonal items way too soon. Past the back to school, back to college section, made me think about a story I recently read on NerdWallet, which was basically framing the declines that colleges and community colleges have seen over the last 2 years. So let's talk about the numbers. Four-year institutions saw enrollment declines of 2.6 to 3.5% last year, while community colleges saw declines of 9.5% to 10.1% overall. Worse yet was that the trend continued to worsen between the fall and spring semester, which was totally opposite of what a lot of people thought would happen. But as it turns out, it seems like remote learning really kind of contributed to that. Couple things, we haven't seen anything on specific local college data. So around us, we haven't seen the enrollment figures yet from the community colleges around us in the Finger Lakes and Central New York and Southern Tier. But also there's this optimism, and I'm not really sure if it's fairly placed optimism, that enrollment's just going to start to come back this coming fall and into the spring semester. I suppose for the economy, we all should be hopeful that that happens, because a lot of the colleges, even community colleges in the region, are gigantic employers. And if they were to downsize or close, that would definitely do a number on some of the economy locally. That said, what do the numbers say to you? What do you do when you hear those declines and you think about where we are now and where we're going, vaccination and all that kind of stuff? Remote learning appears to be in the rearview mirror for the most part. What do the numbers tell you about where colleges are headed this fall?
Well, looking backwards, I think remote learning had something to do with it. I think an increasing number of students and their parents said, why do I want to spend $50,000 a year to watch videos? Frankly. Going forward, I think it ties into the economy again. I think an increasing number of people are starting to say, why do I want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for a college education, the purpose of which is supposed to be to get me a better job, when there are a lot of indications it might not? I mean, we're seeing more and more people get out of college with expensive degrees and not be able to find a good paying job in that field, and just the cost overall. Increasingly, a lot of 22, 23-year-old people are entering the workforce having essentially bought a house before they buy a house. I mean, when you take out all those student loans and you owe $150,000 in student loans, that's like trying to pay off a mortgage before you even set foot into the working world. So I think that, I don't know what colleges are going to be able to do about that, but that's just my 2-cent opinion. And full disclosure, I work part-time for Hobart and William Smith doing sports, and I'm paid for that. So I think people are questioning whether it's worth spending that much money for less of a guarantee than ever that it's going to pay off down the line. It used to be, okay, I get a degree, I'll get a much better job. Now it's I get a degree and I might not get a much better job.
Yeah, I think, I don't have a ton of thoughts on this part of it, but this is essentially a worker shortage conversation again, which really is what all of this stuff boils down to. There aren't that many good paying jobs on the other side of these college degrees, and a lot of college degrees, ironically enough, have some of the lowest paid work after. Think of social workers, you think of people who are working in public service where money isn't that readily available. There's teachers in other states, maybe not so much New York State, but you start to think about that part of it, and you can understand why there is a decline happening. The other thing too is you've got the free tuition happening at the state level, which encourages people to go to, and I think this is emblematic of that, the difference, right, in decline at four-year schools versus the decline that we're seeing happen at community colleges. If it's free to go to a community college and a four-year SUNY school, because SUNY runs all of them, then what's the incentive to go to a community college? There is none. And then on top of that, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that really over the last decade, we've been seeing an enrollment decline happen at all of these schools. It's not like this is necessarily something that's brand new that we're just seeing happen now because of the pandemic. Maybe the pandemic accelerated it, but I don't think this is something that we can, purely say is pandemic driven. Now, when we're talking about the viability of some of these schools, I think the pandemic is going to be a big contributor as to whether they're able to continue operating the way they did before the pandemic, coupled up with this decline in enrollment, meaning money. Because if you have fewer students paying tuition and all the other things that come along with going to college, then you have less money to operate with.
And also, going back to the economic side of it, I saw the figure just recently. I think something like 40% of people who take out student loans don't ever finish their degree.
Yeah.
So we have an increasing number of people saddling themselves with this debt, and then life comes along and they can't finish for whatever reason. Now they've got not only big student loans, but they don't have any college degree whatsoever.
Yeah, and I it's so tied to work, the work situation right now, and I want to get into that topic because that's one of the things that you mentioned earlier this week as something you wanted to talk about, and I think it's fair to butt these two up together. The worker shortage struggle is continuing, and once again we're having this conversation. A number of business owners have taken to social media, as we've talked about before, to voice their concerns about the labor shortage that exists in pretty much every community. We're seeing more restaurants operate on shorter hours. We're seeing different types of service industry businesses have to change the way they do business to accommodate having fewer staff working. It seems like there has been a lot of focus on the unemployment benefits. And we've talked about that, and we've tried to debunk that as being one of the issues.
Well, and frankly, early on, I believed it, and I thought that was a big factor. But I've seen evidence since that you were right on this one, and it really wasn't that big a factor.
Well, and to that end, I had that conversation the other day with a couple different business owners who I just happened to run into that I know, and they said, "Well, geez, I'm offering $14, $15 an hour, $16 an hour, and I still can't get people to work. This unemployment stuff is crazy." And I'm thinking to myself, are you doing the math on the unemployment? Because that's not the reason that people aren't coming to work. Like, people aren't coming to work because there aren't enough workers to go around, period. Like, you have all these businesses that relied on, I'll say light part-time employees. And you don't have people looking for those jobs at this point. It has absolutely nothing to do with a wage or anything else. And on top of that, $14 or $15 an hour, if you haven't noticed, pretty much everybody's offering that right now. So you're just competing with the same people you were always competing with. So I think there's going to have to be a retooling overall of how we actually, pay workers, what's a fair wage, and, whether some businesses are viable because of that. Because you know what? Like, if it comes down to businesses having to pay $18 to say $22 an hour for entry-level work, maybe some businesses that have been able to operate because wages are so low aren't able to operate moving forward, or in this next, the next version of this economy that we're seeing coming out of the pandemic.
I looked this up the other day, and I don't remember the source I found, but it said that the minimum wage, and they compared it to worker productivity, which I think is a better benchmark than inflation, because I think most of us would agree if my work is twice as valuable to my employer as it was last year, I should get paid twice as much for doing that work. If the minimum wage had kept up with worker productivity from the 60s to today, the minimum wage today would be $24 an hour. So the reason people aren't flocking back to take your $15 offer, that's not enough to have a decent life anymore. When apartment rents are $800 and $1,000 and cars cost what cars cost, people can't make it. And I haven't seen this figure, and maybe I'll do some digging around to see if I can find it. I believe that many of these jobs that employers are having a hard time filling are not people's primary jobs. I think what you're looking at is somebody who had one job deciding they can do without the second. I really believe, because you got to remember this past year plus, there were several months where we didn't have very many places to spend money, even if we wanted to.
Yeah.
We couldn't go to a restaurant, or maybe we could go for takeout. But I think a lot of people got used to doing with less, and they've decided, you know what, I really don't need to work that extra 20 hours a week. I'll just buy less stuff. Yep. So it's a whole economic issue that needs to be looked at, not just this wage. And there was some of the stories about when the minimum wage first went to $15, or in New York they were proposing it going to $15, and there were people who said that'll just ruin businesses. They did studies in the communities that were the first to go up to $15 in places like California and Portland, Oregon, And in the places that went up to 15 first, the economy thrived. Because when you pay workers more, they have more money to spend. It winds up back in the hands of the business owners eventually, one way or the other. If you pay all your workers, if the minimum wage were $30 an hour, business owners would scream, but all their employees would have tons of money and they'd come around and they'd spend it.
Yeah, I mean, and to sort of put a cherry on top of that point, there are plenty of high-paying jobs that are out there and available and going unfilled. And almost, it's interesting because even jobs that pay $50, $60, $70, $80,000 a year, there are dozens and dozens of those in every community readily available, and they're going unfilled too. It's not like this is exclusively, and that's why I kind of think this all boils down to a pipeline problem, which gets us back to the college issue, right? We are not doing a good job of getting people into jobs, and just blaming, when you look at the bottom of the totem pole and you say, well, people don't want to do these jobs, so they're lazy, but you don't apply the same stereotype to the jobs and the people who, you know, hold college degrees and happen to have, you know, gone most of their careers making above median salary. It feels a little disingenuous, at least to me, because it's clearly an education problem. I'll use my wife's profession as an example. She does X-ray, and in New York State, there are very few colleges that actually offer the X-ray program. They're very hard to get into, and at the end of the day, or at the end of the year, I suppose it would be, you wind up having what is quite literally dozens of open opportunities in every community that has a healthcare facility of any kind, and not enough people to fill those positions because there aren't enough people getting into it.
I keep going back to, you know, and I don't know how representative my little town in New Hampshire was, but I remember as a high school graduate in the 70s, you know, in a typical year out of our graduating classes in my high school, maybe 30% might go to a four-year college.
Yeah.
Some would enlist in the military. Others would go to some kind of technical school. It wasn't really pushed on everyone to go to four-year college and get a degree. Today, there's a big push. I mean, I don't know what the figure is, but it's probably closer to 90% that are going to four-year colleges. So I think maybe, I like that pipeline analogy, I think maybe we might be better off if we encouraged more people to go into technical training, like becoming an X-ray technician. We hear all the time about how they're opening in the trades. There's openings for plumbers. There's openings for construction people. But I think there's, I don't know if stigma is the right word, but maybe it is the right word, a kind of a stigma, you know, oh, you didn't go to college, you became a plumber. Well, who cares? If you make good money as a plumber, that's better than being unemployed as a history major.
To be honest, I think it's worse than that. I think it's nobody knows how to get to any. And this is where I think the pipeline and education portion of this is so important. Community colleges in general, have spent so much time trying to really lean into the academic side of what they are, and so little time really focusing on churning out a high number of technically ready workforce that you've essentially become, the workforce overall has essentially become depressed. And you have this shortage in so many areas.
I don't know if I'm going to agree with you there. Maybe some colleges that way. I have a monthly segment with Finger Lakes Community College, and they've really gone hard in the direction of preparing people for careers. I mean, they've worked specifically with employers on tailoring their curriculum to turning out people who are ready to work. That may not be the case at some community colleges, but I know there are at least some that are looking in that direction of, it's not what piece of paper you have, it's what you can do with it after you get it.
So my skepticism of that is, and I know the kind of programs you're talking about. My skepticism of that is that it's a minuscule portion of their total effort, right? So They're turning out maybe, you know, I recall, use Finger Lakes Community College as an example, and I don't want to throw them under the bus, but I recall within the last couple years, getting a press release announcing that, they had worked with this large employer and they turned out 35 people who were ready to go work at blah, 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 blah. And it was this big, like, pat yourselves on the back moment. And it was viewed as this really big success story. And I'm thinking to myself, it's 35 people. Like, that's like throwing a penny into the ocean. We are so beyond like these little kind of like cosmetic, oh, hey, look at what we did. These little token efforts at trying to fix this problem. That
if a million people throw a penny into the ocean,
well, right. So
up.
that's
I mean,
right. It needs to be every. It needs to be every
sure.
college.
Okay.
It needs to be every high school. It needs to be every It needs to be quite literally everywhere, and it needs to be. I use the percentage analogy there. Like, needs to be 70% of their effort.
Maybe high schools ought to teach less, trigonometry, which are you really, that was the old joke when we were kids is, when am I ever going to use that? Well, the answer is you're probably not. So maybe plumbing ought to be a course in high school, or maybe balancing a checkbook or how to buy a car ought to be courses in high school.
I think we should look, frankly, and I've had this conversation with school leaders in different communities. It's time to treat high school as a transitional period instead of treating it as we need to get to this end goal, which is graduation, because graduation doesn't mean anything if you don't have some sort of transitional plan in place, whether that means going to college. And there has been, there are plenty of opportunities to get into college essentially while you're still in high school, to take college classes, that sort of thing. But aside from BOCES programs, which I don't think are actually promoted to enough students, you don't have these sort of like training, ready to work programs at the high school level. And I think we're getting to a point where high school needs to be so tailored that it almost is a completely individual experience in the way that college can be or should be.
And I think one of the reasons you mentioned BOCES, I think one of the reasons those programs aren't pushed more is, again, I think there's that stigma. I think there's a sense that BOCES is where you go when you're, quote, not smart enough for college. And I don't think that's the case, and I think it's a bad message to set. But I hope some people are watching this, because I think we've just reformed our education system. And if they'll follow our plan, I think we'll be in good shape. Well,
and to make matters worse, you've also got, again, I'll go back to the X-ray example that I used earlier. The requirements to become an X-ray technician in New York State are completely out of line with most other states. Most other states are essentially treated as on-the-job training. You are trained at a hospital, you complete some certification, and someone signs off on it, and you move on, and you're an X-ray tech. In New York State, it is a 3-year program that is pretty goddamn intense, and you get no breaks. And it is similar to the nursing program in intensity, but it's one of these scenarios where it's not an easy road. Like, it isn't a road that's paved in gold. It's quite literally if you can survive it, congratulations.
Well, and it's interesting because I believe that was one of the things in the governor's executive order on the whole gun issue the other day. I think part of it was easing some of those regulatory burdens towards getting some of these licenses. So maybe there's something that we can hang our hat on in that proclamation, because I think one of the things that they talked about was, it's ridiculous, some of the licensing and some of the red tape that you have to go through to get into a profession. But I think that's, and it's neat because we're coming back to talking about our bigger issues again now that we're not so COVID focused as we've been for the last 15 months or so. But I guess that's the hard part, again, is looking at all of these things. Look at what we've talked about today. We've talked about gun violence. We've talked about government meetings. All these different things, and they all come kind of back to being a part of this same whole that we are unwilling or unable as a society to tackle, and understanding how the economics tie in and how this ties into that and this works with that.
Well, and how many times have we sat here and listened to education leaders say, education, education, education? Like, all of these problems come back to education. And if you really fix K through 12, or at least 9 through 12, and really modernize it and really fix it in a way that make sense not just for students and for the community in these school districts, but also the economy and the workforce and all these other things, you kind of alleviate a lot of problems. You fix all, it's like the one thing is, is there one thing you can do to fix 5 or 6 or 7 problems? This is probably one of the few issues that you can fix and also alleviate a lot of other problems along the way.
And traditionally, one of the purposes of public education has just been that we should be well-rounded people, and we should understand world history. But when you think about it, again, which course does me the most good in my adult life? Learning European history and knowing who attacked who in 1817, or some simple home economics, like here's how you make a budget in your household, here's how you determine whether to pay the rent first or the food bill first, and here's why you might not be able to afford the perfect car you want first time out of the box. I mean, those kind of practical things have always sort of been looked down upon by, I think, the education establishment, but maybe it's time that they not be, and maybe we just really need to have a re-examination of what we're teaching and turn it more towards preparation to be a functioning adult.
Yeah.
I mean, and I was, I love history and science, and I mean, I'm glad I learned all those things, but maybe it's just we should learn more practical things. Maybe we should all have a carpentry course in high school, so when our steps break, we can fix them,
Yeah, I would agree with that one. So one last topic here before we get going. The Moravia school principal that we talked about a couple months ago on the show has retired after being placed on administrative leave with a bunch of question marks attached to it. The Auburn Citizen did some great reporting this week on the topic, and we learned that Principal Bruce McMain will receive $380,000 in payments along with lifetime fully paid health insurance after an early retirement agreement was reached. Last time we talked about this, we both took issue with the fact that there wasn't really much disclosure about what was going on. And now we've effectively learned that because of a confidentiality clause, no one will ever learn what really happened here. And the investigation is apparently closed. Your thoughts here on where we stand or what should be in place to avoid this type of scenario from playing out in the future?
Well, number one, this is where we start, and I've been a huge advocate of this in several cases on my show. Accusation does not equal guilt. So for starters, organizations, when one of your employees is accused of a crime, it does not mean that he's guilty, and you should take no action until there is some establishment of guilt.
Yeah.
That would be a good start. If the board hadn't put him off on administrative leave, none of this would have happened. And then one can only assume, since the school board is paying him a substantial amount of money and keeping it quiet, that these accusations apparently had little or no merit. Because if there had been merit behind them, they wouldn't be paying him $380,000. They'd be putting him in handcuffs and sending him off to jail. So that would be the first part. And it disturbs me every time I see somebody suspended or fired from a job on an accusation of something, rather than just being patient and finding out. If these accusations are made, let the people who made them prove them. And if they can't, then we'll go on with our business.
And mind you, there are people who defend this process endlessly, who say, look, these are personnel issues. They shouldn't be publicly discused in that way. But
when
the
you're
response
spending my
is,
tax money on them,
exactly,
that goes out the window. Sorry.
And like I mentioned when I was on your show this morning, look, like this is pretty unique in the volume of the payout. So this is a significant payout and much larger than the average payout for early retirement or for an exit. And this played out very publicly for, a few months, and now the public is left completely in the dark. The reason why we absolutely need to see change on this front is because there needs to be accountability. Like someone needs to be held accountable.
Someone screwed up here.
Right.
Most likely the school board or
the
school administration or both. Because the reason they're paying him $380,000 in my humble opinion, is to avoid having to pay him $500,000 or $1 million in the lawsuit that he no doubt would have filed, and from what we know, won. And if you're out there on the Moravia School Board or administration going, "Oh, you're making these wild accusations," what information do we have to go on? All we have to go on is that you're paying him a great deal of money, which tells me that you probably would have gotten sued and lost for a great deal more.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is pretty much all the time we have for today. Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
On the Finger Lakes Morning News. In Auburn, that's 96.3 and 1590 WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 and 1240 WGVA, Monday through Friday, 5:30 to 9.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Listen to Ted Monday through Friday on Finger Lakes News Radio, and be sure to join us back here next week on the Weekend Debrief. We'll see you then.